Okay, one more question. You mentioned those fishing boats, those militias. They pretend to be civilian, but can be used, militarily. Is it maybe similar with all the overseas Chinese communities that are in name only, maybe for the trade and they expand businesses, but because the CCP has hold on their lives and their relatives in China, they can at any moment be used, for spying, to apply pressure, to collect knowledge. So, could you maybe tell us how does it look like on those Pacific islands? There's like what Chinese showing up with their businesses, creating shops, killing the competition, and then how does it go to the top?
Mhm. Well, you've laid it out. You've laid out most of it. Is that the Chinese? It starts with commercial presence.
Yes,
Chinese businesses go in, and these are often very small businesses. It could be the corner shop,
yes,
and then you'll have, say, fishing companies that come in. You may have a small construction company that comes in, and then bigger companies come in, and this establishes a presence, both a commercial presence, but also a presence of Chinese people. And this, of course, leads to political influence because it brings money with it. And what happens is the Chinese build up a constituency. They build up a body of people in a given country that sees China as the attractive option, and they become pro-China. Uh, this can be business people, but influential people, including particularly politicians, because if they see the Chinese as a source of money for them personally, but also for the country itself, where there often isn't a whole lot going on. So you get the commercial presence, physical presence, the political influence, and with that, they are also able, say, to, as happened in the Solomon Islands, Chinese interests, they bribed Solomon officials to effectively drive out a major Australian mining company, replaced with a Chinese mining company. You had Chinese businessmen buying property in places that would be very good Navy bases, very good places for the Chinese Navy to operate. And this was going on years before Solomon Islands switched recognition from Taiwan to China, and before they signed that agreement just recently, that it potentially allows the Chinese Navy in. So the third piece of this sequence, commercial, political influence, is the military presence, and that those have come late. But China's effectively sort of getting things ready, greasing the skids. And in Solomon Islands, now you're going to see the Chinese military showing up. And this will probably happen in other countries as well before long, in the Pacific and Latin America, Asia, Africa as well. But it's a predictable sequence. You see it happening all the time. And part of the problem is that the Americans in particular don't have much of a diplomatic presence in the Pacific. So there's no alternative to the Chinese when they come. Say we don't. Americans are terrible. We do a poor job at so-called political warfare, of influencing, propaganda in the good meaning of the word. We're just not there, and the U.S. military often isn't there as well. So vacuums get filled, and we've created these vacuums, allowed them to exist, and we haven't filled them. But that sequence that you've described and that I've elaborated a bit on, you see it play out everywhere: Pacific, Latin America, Africa, as well. But often it just needs to be challenged. And when there's an alternative, that a lot of people want that. And also keep in mind, and the Solomon Islands is a good example. Most people don't want this deal with the Chinese,
yes.
but the Chinese have bought off the prime minister and
Elites, yes,
his, yeah, and that group, and a lot of them have put their money into Australia, into
yes,
Australian real estate, and the Australians have done nothing about it. And you'll find that the opposition generally gets ignored. Unfortunately, people tend to only talk to the pro-Chinese prime minister instead of giving some moral support and some other support to the opposition and the people who do want sort of consensual government, who don't want really atheist Chinese uh, dominating their country, cutting down the forest, vacuuming up the oceans, etc. And that's really is where we should be providing, sort of putting a lot of our efforts and attentions. But Solomon Islands, you really see that on display. This dynamic at work.
My last question is, we saw it now with the Russia-Ukraine war, that at some point Putin was threatening a nuclear attack, and I don't think anyone really believed it too much. But in case of China, I think it's different because they've been threatening the Americans at least for 2 decades. You can find it in James Mann's book about face, long time ago. Now they threaten Australia and Japan. Again, it's just journalists, it's former military people, but the government supports it and never denies it. So what's your take on the nuclear threat? Because in my opinion, and if it's really serious and they attack Taiwan, they might be able to at least use a nuclear option, at least to a little extent somewhere, just to threaten the West.
Yes, I think that's possible. I would assume that China will consider using any weapon in its arsenal. That includes biological weapons that I think, have sort of tried it out. They've seen the results of it. But nuclear weapons, yes, I think that is possible. And that's the assumption that I make. There's different ways you could employ them. One would be if you really just wanted to soften up Taiwan, put a tactical nuclear weapon into Taipei. Or if you wanted to be nice about it, you could perhaps drop one into the ocean east of Taiwan at the beginning and tell the Americans, stand clear. We don't want to fight with you, but we're willing to use more nuclear weapons if it comes to that. And depending on the administration in Washington, that might work. But the Chinese, I think, certainly would consider using nuclear weapons. They'll pretty much do what they think they can get away with, and that in some ways it typifies communist Chinese foreign policy for years. Is that when they can get away with something, they're constantly pushing, but when they think the time is right, they'll make a move. And if they think that they can get away with using nuclear weapons, or that I think they would do it. But once again, if they think they will lose everything, if they do it, they probably won't. But the dynamic is very much like the bully in the schoolyard. That if somebody's going to fight him and can do it and hurt him, he's going to back off. But if he thinks he can get away with something, he's going to push and push and push. So that's my take on it.
Thank you very much for your time. It was very insightful.
Well, pleasure. I was glad to have the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.